Welcome to Voices in Value-Based Care. I'm Beth Houck. Thanks for tuning in. The movement to value-based care is revolutionizing how healthcare providers get reimbursed for delivery of care. In this program, we're going to explore stories from the field about how real organizations are dealing with this change. You can follow the show on Twitter at #VoicesInVBC and follow me on Twitter at BA Houck. On the program today, I talk with my friend and colleague, Tom Lee, founder and CEO of SA Ignite. Tom, welcome to the show.
Hey, Beth, thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here.
This is going to be a fun one. So, Tom, if you can just kind of tell the audience a little bit about yourself and a little bit about SA Ignite, so everybody knows, of course, from my bio that that's where I work, but we don't usually talk about what we do.
Yeah. Happy to do so. Our path has really been on helping organizations manage the complexity and really simplify operations and optimization of value-based care programs, starting from the early days of meaningful use and now all the way through MIPS and expanding into other programs. The perspective I bring is actually originally as being an outsider to healthcare, working primarily in the telecommunications industry, and before that being kind of a reformed scientist of sorts. But really taking an interest in healthcare through some family experiences, as many of us have, that really sparked my interest in trying to apply some of the capabilities of IT and analytics to improving the situation in healthcare. And that led to the founding of the company and, of course, joining forces with folks like yourself, Beth, and really building into what's been a great journey, working with many provider organizations around the country, and now looking at kind of what's going to be unfolding in the road ahead.
So I think one of the fun things about Tom in the company, he's the professor of SA Ignite, and one of the fun things that we do a lot is do a lot of thinking and riffing around where are things going. So one of the concepts that you and I have presented on together is this notion of the macro legislation came out. We have lots of customers that are working in MIPS, and we see it as somewhat foundational for the future, that people are building towards broader value-based care programs, and that MIPS serves as a nice foundation for that. When you think about the 2019 regulations and what you're seeing in the market right now, how do you think that's further demonstrating that MIPS is foundational?
Yeah, I think if you take a portfolio view, and this is certainly the way we look at it with respect to what CMS is doing, some of the changes in particular for this year in MIPS, it really mirrors really things that CMS is doing on other fronts in terms of driving greater accountability for providers. So, for example, now with the changes to the bundled payment portfolio for CMS, and now revisiting potentially making some of the models mandatory again, that really is putting more of the onus again on providers to say, look, this is happening. The solvency of the country really depends on transforming healthcare delivery and payment. And when we look at MIPS as really the foundational and beginning piece of that, there are very specific things within even changes for this year that really echo what we're seeing on the other side of the equation. So, for example, amping up the competition of the program by increasing the MIPS performance thresholds. You can see in the quality category more of the measures being more stringently scored because it could be a measure that maybe the whole country is doing very well on. And so not wanting to give providers as much credit as before for doing well on those measures. And in light of that, CMS really looking at the median score for MIPS dropping around 12% this year versus past years would be a consequence of that. Increasing the financial impact of the program as well by making it such that there'll be fewer organizations that will will partake in an exceptional performance incentive pool, raising the importance of cost containment by increasing the weight on the cost category. And then finally, also looking at emphasizing the importance of data interoperability through the promoting interoperability category in MIPS, making it harder to achieve a perfect score in that category, and really narrowing down the measures to really focus more on those actions that are going to really give patients a lot more control over their data. And that also mirrors the general message from CMS that interoperability and data transparency are absolutely core to value-based care transformation.
You know, it's interesting. We just came back from a user group meeting where we talked a lot about these concepts, and we talked a lot about things with customers, about things they're doing right now that they can leverage for the future and therefore take on more risk. And one of the things that did come up, to your point, is interoperability, because I think the notion of the more stringent HIE measure for the promoting interoperability category is being kind of seen as, this is going to be hard. But at the same time, we heard a lot about a lot of efforts going on to have more care coordination, which they know as a foundational element for value-based care. So seeing that connection is really rewarding, like that some of those policy changes are really, kind of signaling to the market that you have to do these things in order to do some of those foundational things for value-based care.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other part of interoperability is linked to having more participants on the innovation side. Think of third-party app developers now that have much more access to EHR application marketplaces, to do deeper integration with EHRs and do some really novel things that larger players like EHR vendors may be harder pressed to move fast enough and to innovate in many different ways. And MIPS, with the requirement of moving to 2015 edition technology that has those integration interfaces, I think is just another example of how MIPS, alongside these other programs, are all kind of moving in the same direction in terms of trying to make the healthcare system a lot more patient-centric.
And you bring up a great point. I think the interoperability challenge is going to be solved lots of different ways, not necessarily just by everybody adopting the same couple EHRs. There's still lots of people on lots of different systems, and they're going to have to be talking to each other. And so solving that via, third-party app developers, just like you said, could be an interesting way that we haven't actually seen in the market to solve some of those interoperability challenges. One of the other things that came up at the user group that I think is an interesting piece of feedback is the connection between the finance department and the quality department needs to get stronger. And so what I mean is, in general, you have the quality regulatory folks, all the people that are doing all the work to ensure that that clinicians are getting the highest possible scores in the quality category and across actually all the categories for the MIPS program and for other value-based care contracts that they have. Yet the finance department is doing some modeling around what the financial impact might be, but they're not necessarily communicating on a very regular basis about what are the types of measures that should be in the contracts themselves in the first place. What do you think about this? I mean, is this surprising to you to hear this? Because it was a little bit surprising to me.
Yeah, I do share in some of your surprise because on the one hand, certainly the value-based care has been around long enough where one would think that some of these silos would start to break down in a more expedient fashion. On the other side is that really there are really kind of two different modes of thinking here, that have to be reconciled, because a lot of what, from a quality management standpoint, is often the bottleneck is really how to engage providers, how to make measures not only meaningful to patients, but also meaningful to providers in the sense that they feel like they can really move the needle on those measures. Whereas on the financial side, a lot of it is about contract optimization and there's really not that kind of sixth sense for, okay, which measures are actually going to be able to create some cultural alignment and really among the providers, as well as really be able to generate some of its own momentum in terms of being able to really do well on those measures. So I think that we've just seen organizations at very different points along that spectrum in terms of the level of collaboration between the two sides. But now that I think as the move towards risk continues, there will be a greater push for, in particular, the quality department to get involved more deeply and more early, or at an earlier stage within the formation and negotiation of these contracts, whether it be with commercial payers, pay for performance programs, ACO structures, et cetera. I think we'll start to see that happen more and more, but it's a long process.
It is, and I think one of the things that was kind of a fun reaction was the notion that we should stay in fee-for-service as long as possible. That's always going to be the better route for us, is starting to erode. So where the quality folks are saying, well, we didn't know we could tell them about how well we're performing in certain ways as a way to enhance our financial rewards. And the finance folks are kind of in the mode of let's stay as fee-for-service as possible. So this idea that the quality folks could perhaps push the finance folks to put that dip into some kinds of value-based care because they know they're going to perform well, because they have done all these investments, because they are doing all this work right now, was kind of an aha moment for them.
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
Yeah. So thinking again about investments, like when you think about all the investments that organizations are making in infrastructure, in breaking down silos, in new technology, in looking at outside apps and technology that never actually existed before in healthcare, what do you think? What types of investments at this point do you think are going to have the most leverage?
I think first of all, it's been an incredibly active time in terms of just the volume and the speed of different innovations and different choices that providers have, among whether it's infrastructure, technologies, different types of partner relationships and types of business models. And so I think the way I approach it is to first think about, what are some of the key value propositions of any particular, let's say, technology or combinations of solutions. What are the key value propositions that potentially deserve the greatest amount of attention or investment? And so kind of starting from there and then seeing, okay, well, what are some of the particular external solutions, for example, that can help with those things? So from a value proposition standpoint, I think one is being able to provide leadership with more forward visibility on what's the financial impact of a particular program or a whole portfolio of programs. What are the key lever points within each of these programs where you have the greatest opportunity to improve, hopefully with the minimal amount of effort. That's one, I think, a very key value that leadership is often looking for, because now when there's a lot of downward financial pressure on reimbursement overall, often the predictability you have around the dollars and cents is what often carries the day or determines what you can or can't do. The second value prop is in terms of what types of solutions can actually really engage clinicians a lot more in the improvement process. How do you actually carry out a plan? How do you get clinicians really involved in that, whether it's within their workflow, whether it's providing performance feedback to them in a more efficient way, or in a way that's, for example, gamifying, certain ways of providing feedback to really make it a lot more competitive among clinicians, kind of tap into that competitive spirit. And many other ways of doing that is how do you get clinicians a lot more engaged in this process, moving away kind of from the earlier days of value-based care, where it was much more checking the box and getting over certain thresholds, and then you're kind of done. Whereas now it's a lot more of a continuous improvement process where clinicians have to really continually be involved and really actively contributing to how the organization moves forward and how it really adopts yet another program that might be looked at by a different payer. It just grows and grows. So I think those are really kind of the two big value props.
We started when the conversation talking a bit about the MIPS program and specifically about some of the changes in the regulation that are really driving and signaling towards greater value-based care and taking on more risk. I think probably the biggest signal in the macro legislation broadly was the new MSSP rule, which really is pushing people down the path towards taking risk quite a bit more quickly. Tell me a little bit about your perspectives on that rule and what you think, how you think the market's going to react to it.
Yeah, there's definitely been quite a bit of reaction, certainly when the proposed rule came out, and a lot of advocacy efforts around it. Looking at where the final rule has ended up, I think there's definitely some good things in there for existing MSSP ACOs that are, for probably a variety of reasons, pretty entrenched in the program. So, for example, having better predictability and some adjustments around the benchmarking process, I think those are, I think have been generally well received. Also other benefits such as opening up more flexibility on telehealth, use of telehealth, we just talked about, as well as providing the ability to provide beneficiaries some actual monetary incentives for receiving primary care services to help in the prevention, the whole prevention cycle, and reducing kind of longer term costs. I think those are some good things. But I think then the other side, probably the biggest question that's weighing in people's minds, whether they're in the program and let's say toward an expiring an agreement period coming up, or whether they're looking at entering the program de novo, is the fact that now the fact that you can now only stay in a one-sided track, what was previously 6 years down to now only 2 to 3 years if you're a new ACO. That's a fairly large drop in the amount of time you could spend a one-sided track. And so if you think about the startup costs, implementation costs, and the time it takes to really get enough experience under your belt to really start going to two-sided, I do tend to believe CMS's prediction that over the next 5 to 10 years or so, there will be fewer new ACOs created as a result of just that one factor. The other factor, which has been negotiated back, I would say, would just be the amount of shared savings that an organization in a one-sided track can get. That's now somewhat lower than it was before. So I think that would just give folks another thing to think about, particularly if they're now currently in the program at a higher shared savings rate, and they basically get about a 20% decrease in what that shared savings can be. That may affect kind of the financial calculus for some of the ACOs. I think in the shorter term, there's around 200 Track 1 ACOs now. This is the one-sided model that's currently in place. About 200 or so who have their current agreements expiring on June 30th, because the vast majority of these organizations took a 6-month extension from the end of last year to June 30th this year. And then beyond that point, if they continue in the program, they only get another 1.5 years more in the one-sided model, versus those that were originally going into their second agreement period under the original program would have had 3 more years. So I think that what we're hearing is a lot of organizations still kind of struggling a little bit with that decision. In fact, today is the deadline for the notice of intent to apply for that agreement, the first agreement period under the new program starting July 1st. And it's only about another month from now when the application is due, unless CMS makes a change to that. But that was just recently announced. that there'd only be another month to make that decision. So, we'll see what happens. But I think there'll be a fair number that we may decide to really step aside from the program for a while and see how it goes. They can always re-enter later on when more is clear about how organizations are faring under the new model. But I think it will have a material impact on the participation rates in the short term in the MSSP program.
I do wonder also whether it will change the configuration. And what I mean is, we've heard of a lot of ACOs that are, say, in the ACO with everybody else in their market, which includes a couple of their competitors. And that's fine when you're dating, but when you're ready to get married and take risk, you kind of take a new look at those partners and really see whether or not those are the people that you think you can continue down that path with. So I think we're going to see a little bit of new ACOs that are maybe smaller. I don't know.
I think that's a great point. I think a great point is there's sort of the perspective of the ACO as a whole, but then there's also the perspective of the individual participants in that ACO. One thing that we've often heard is, a lot of sometimes it can be quite surprising. Sometimes you have a fairly significantly large ACO participant, that's part of a larger ACO, but that ACO participant may be making up 30 to 40% of the size of the whole ACO. But there's often not necessarily the level of communication and coordination between the participant and the ACO. And so when something like this comes along and there's a major change to the rules, there may not be complete alignment in terms of what is, is this really going to be good for the ACO participant relative to now the other options that they have, compared to what staying in the program with all the changes would entail. I think I agree. I think there could be some resetting of partnerships and who folks decide to really collaborate with in the long term.
Exactly. So we covered lots of good ground, but we've been talking a little bit about regulations, but then you also spent some time talking about value propositions that help support what's going on in the market. Kind of taking those two things together, when you think about what advice you would give CMS to enforce more regulation, enforce less regulation, create new regulations of some kinds or new policies, what do you think is needed that will help support this change drive? Like, what do you think that you would, kind of recommendations would you give?
Yeah, and Beth, this will probably be no surprise to you because our company, a lot of it is really centered around data, and I think the things that CMS can do to really make data more accessible, more frequently at a deeper level, make it easier to measure and report performance are things that are worth looking at from a regulatory standpoint. They don't necessarily involve having to create legislation and drive that through Congress. Some might, but I think there's other things that can be done. So for example, one of the things that going forward we see more and more of is just organizations having a lot of different programs, value-based care programs, even just out of CMS, that they need to take on. They might be a highly diverse organization, primary care specialties. They may want to participate in different models that are tuned for different providers or parts of the organization. But there could be very different ways of measuring, for example, quality performance, where if you look at it from a very high level, it's not necessarily clear that they should be measured in a completely different way. So a simple example of that is you look at the MIPS quality measures on the one hand, and about 300 some odd measures in that category that organizations can choose from. But then you look over at, let's say, Medicare Advantage, and there the measures are all using the HEDIS system, which has a huge legacy footprint. There's a lot of history behind that. But if you look at the clinical concepts that are being measured by these two different measurement systems, there's a huge amount of overlap between the two, even though the way in which you calculate and report these measures are entirely different from each other. And so not an easy problem to solve, but there may be some things on the regulatory side where one can try to create some level of more prescriptive harmonization between the two, rather than suggesting that, let's say, Medicare Advantage organizations, try to make it easier in one form or another, but actually putting that into regulation, where maybe there's some way that organizations can more easily leverage their investment in one of the measurement systems in the other program. So
that makes sense.
I think harmonization of measures could be a really, really great way to make things easier for providers, in light of what they already have to do in value-based care.
I agree, and I think we'd get a lot of cheers from that too.
Yeah.
So Tom, I'm positive that we could talk for a lot longer, but we are at the end. So I just want to thank you for making the time to share with the audience things that you and I just chat about in regular settings. And thanks for being a guest on the show.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Beth. It's been great.
Thank you, Tom, and thanks to our audience for tuning in. You can learn more about the show on the programs page on HealthcareNowRadio.com and lend your voice to the conversation on Twitter at #VoicesInVBC, and be sure to follow me on Twitter at BA Houck. I'm Beth Houck, bringing you the voices in value-based care you should hear. Until next time, have a great week.